Our final question today comes from a couple in Williamsport, Pennsylvania. They write, does the Bible have anything to say against interracial marriage, such as a Caucasian marrying an African American?
No, I don't think biblically that you could build any kind of case for that at all. But if you want to get off and look at marriage, I had a question on divorce just a few moments ago, and we were looking at it. Well, my feeling is, as I said then, it's the question of marriage. There are people getting married. It's not people getting a divorce. There are people getting married that ought not to get married. Now, what constitutes a good marriage? Well, a saved and an unsaved person ought not to marry. They're not thinking along the same lines. And there are other things that separate us. I think that races have their difficulties. Years ago, there was a play in New York City called Abe's Irish Rose, a Jew that married a Gentile. And it was made into a comedy, of course. But the real thing, and I saw that enacted in Nashville, that Abe married an Irish Rose, and I want to tell you that they didn't have many bar mitzvahs, by the way. They had nothing in the world but trouble and finally a divorce. My feeling is that people ought to be pretty close together that get married. They should think alike. They should have the same philosophy of life. They should feel the same way about things. I think it's tragic to have a marriage like they had in the funny papers years ago. Maggie and Jiggs. You know, she was forever throwing a rolling pin and bouncing it off his head, a poor fella. And what was it? Well, he liked to go down to Denny Moore's and eat cabbage and drink beer. And she wanted to make society. And that causes problems, you see. That's the thing I'm talking about in marriage. I think young people ought to be told just not to be romantic and in love with each other. That's wonderful. That's the basis of it, by the way. But let's look at something else. I counseled one time a young couple, and I found out my counseling was not always good, but it was in this particular case. This young man was a bank clerk, and I'd been a bank clerk, and I know how bank clerks can handle a lot of money but be very poor. And he was a bank clerk, and I met him several times. He was a very crude fellow. We had a young lady in the church that had been born in China, not of missionaries, but of an oil man over there, and they were apparently very wealthy. And she had been sent to this country to the finest finishing schools, and she was one of the most cultured young ladies I think I've ever met. And he was the crudest young man I've ever met. And I gave them a warning. I told her, I says, I think that you'll have trouble down the way. And a year hadn't gone by till she came in my study one day, and she told me, says, it's happened. Says, we had our first fight, and she showed me bruises on her arms and face. He had struck her. And I'll be honest with you, I lose respect of any man that will strike a woman, especially his wife. He has no right to do that. And she left him and ultimately got a divorce from him. Now, they should not have got married, although it was quite romantic. He was a handsome young man, but as crude as they come. And she just happened to be the very opposite. Now, that sort of thing's not going to work in a marriage. We need to recognize that more today. And that's the reason I say that racial marriage, regardless of what races, they ought to think long about that sort of thing, because when we think differently, when we are in a different world, why, it means a very lonely life for both of them, even when it is a success.